Jamestown Colony. In 1606, James I grants a charter for 2 overlapping land grants to 2 separate joint stock companies. These are not to be royal colonies, but are business ventures. Settlers would be regulated by the stockholders, not the crown. Both companies send settlers in 1607, but only one settlement is successful. It is led by the Virginia Company of London, and their ship heads for the Virginia coastline. On May 1607, their ships with 104 colonists sail up the James River and choose a site they call Jamestown in honor of their king. Now, if you've ever been to Jamestown, especially in the summertime, you may say to yourself, why did they pick this swampy, bug-infested site? There was a sound reason for doing so. Jamestown Island offered a number of natural defenses against the Spanish. Now, there were several places upriver that could be fortified to protect Jamestown Island from approaching ships and give advance warning. One of those islands they named Hog Island, partly because the hogs were kept there. It had a clear view to the mouth of the river, and it screened Jamestown Island from view of any ships coming upriver. So they built a blockhouse there with a 20-foot lookout. Jamestown Island itself was connected only by a narrow creek to the mainland in 1607. And so again, they built a blockhouse there in 1608 to protect that little spit of land, that natural bridge. Natural ridges and marshes allowed them to build their fort on the high ridge along the river with low marshy ground to defend the land side. The channel in James River was another decisive factor. It only allowed close anchorage in one spot on the western edge, so enemy ships would have had to sail past the fort before they could come in close to unmanned men. So, was there a real threat to the colony from Spain, or was this just English paranoia? The truth is, there was a threat. The Spanish ambassador urged the Spanish crown to destroy any fledgling English Virginia colony from 1605 to 1610. The Spanish Council of War planned to attack every year from 1607 to 1617, but never did because the Spanish were also involved in European wars and didn't have the time or the money to spend it on wiping the English out at Jamestown. So having protected themselves from the Spanish, they now could set about growing their colony, although there was nothing sure thing about the Jamestown colony. And in fact, it almost failed several times. In the first year, there was very little discipline. The gentlemen adventurers who dominated the group expected riches to fall into their laps. They didn't start cultivation. Remember that you can't rely on ships to come back and forth from England to feed you. You can't rely on buying food from the Native Americans. So when relief ships came in January 1608, there were only 38 survivors left. Effective leadership was missing in the colony until 1608, when the council chose John Smith to be president of the council. Now, Smith was a veteran soldier, and he immediately, along with his men, instituted military discipline. All but the 6 were organized into gangs. And Smith and his men ensured that there was sufficient food and housing for the winter. They laid down rules for maintaining sanitation and hygiene to limit disease in the colony. And the results of this firm discipline was that during that winter, only 12 men out of the 100 died. Smith also improved relations with the Powhatan Indians. In his explorations, he came in contact with Chief Powhatan, and they liked each other. And Powhatan went ahead and made an alliance with John Smith. Smith continued good relations with the Powhatans through a mixture of his personality and by intimidating Native Americans with exhibitions of English military strength. So things are running well under Smith's leadership. However, he is wounded in a gunpowder explosion in 1609 and is forced to return to England. After he leaves, discipline declines. The colonists do not prepare for the winter, and with food in short supply, they begin to pressure the Native Americans to feed them, causing bad relations bad feelings between the Powhatans and the English. 400 of the 500 colonists died that winter. This is known as the Great Starvation or starving times. They're so hungry they're eating rats, dogs, snakes, toadstools, and horse hides. One man supposedly killed his wife and powdered her down with flour and ate her. Others were eating corpses of people who died of natural causes. Within a year, new leadership and military rule is put back into place, along with an influx of new colonists, and that allows Jamestown to prosper. By 1611, the colony has expanded beyond the 40 miles of Jamestown Island. Agriculture begins and the colony becomes self-sustaining, and in fact the colony is strong enough to win the First Anglo-Powhatan War. The other thing is that Virginia finally finds its gold, not actual gold mineral, but a crop that will bring money to the colony, and that crop is tobacco. John Rolfe, who marries Pocahontas, the daughter of Chief Powhatan, spent several years perfecting the cultivation of tobacco, and by 1619 England was hooked, and tobacco commanded high prices. James I called it that evil weed and said that it was bad for a person's lungs to smoke tobacco, but he was in the minority. Most everyone else in England loved tobacco and was hooked. To increase population, the company offered head rights. A person would be given 50 acres grant of land by paying their own passage or that of their family members or other laborers to the new colony. So by paying for indentured servants, planters were able to acquire large blocks of land and have the labor to develop it. Now, an indentured servitude was a compulsory service for a fixed period of time, ranging anywhere from 3 to 4 to 7 years, depending on the colony and the indenture. Often, this service was in exchange for passage to the colonies. The indenture was a labor contract that spelled out the terms of the agreement. Indentured servitude held out one last desperate choice for thousands of landless or jobless men and women in England. Anyone who was young, single, and marginally healthy could sign away 4 to 7 years of his, or less commonly her, life as a tobacco field worker in exchange for passage to Virginia. You might say, why would anyone do that? But think about it. If you don't have a job, if you're hungry, if it's your option to get out of jail, to sign an indenture and go be an indentured servant in Virginia, you're going to take that chance because there's also at the end of that indenture the possibility of you getting free land. Now, the colony isn't going to give you land, but they're going to point you toward the wilderness and say, there's plenty of land out there, go find it. It also isn't such a crazy idea when you think about the fact that in England there were apprenticeships. In an apprenticeship, you signed 4 to 7 years of your life away to work underneath a craftsman. And during those years, you learned a skill, a trade, and that would then give you a career afterwards. Well, even in these indentures, you may go, what career are you learning by coming to be a tobacco hand? Well, you're learning how to cultivate and grow tobacco. So when you get your land, you can become a successful planter. It wasn't such a crazy idea in a world where there weren't a lot of options. Now, planters preferred a male workforce because they shared the general European assumption that agricultural labor was a masculine activity. Women were supposed to be used for mostly household duties, and women indentured servants were used in that way. But in those early years, many women found themselves working side by side men in the tobacco fields. But the preference for young male workers created an unusual population profile in Virginia and later in other parts of the Chesapeake. Men outnumbered women by 3 to 1, and in some areas as much as by 6 to 1. So a female indentured servant, once she had finished her indenture, had the opportunity to usually marry up in a way that she might not have back in England. Between half to 2/3 of white immigrants who came to the English colonies during the 17th century came as indentured servants. In 1619, a ship arrived at Port Comfort in Virginia, bearing a cargo of 20 to 30 enslaved Africans. These enslaved Africans were not indentured servants. They were coming off of a Dutch slave ship, and they were purchased by Virginians. Some of these enslaved people may have achieved their freedom later. Some may not. But it is really in 1619 that slavery begins in the Virginia colony. In 1622, the colony and the Joint Stock Company found themselves facing three serious problems. For the company, they discovered that local officials were embezzling funds, overcharging for supplies, and using company laborers to work their own tobacco fields. For the colony, a second problem was that the population had a very high death rate. This was due to malnutrition, disease, especially typhus and dysentery, from salt poisoning because a lot of the water around Jamestown was brackish, and that's what they were using for drinking water. So because of all of those reasons, most immigrants from 1618 to 1622 died in the first 3 years. This was known as the seasoning period. If you made it through the first 3 years, there's a good chance you're probably going to continue for many more years. And the third problem was relations with the Powhatans worsened after Pocahontas died in England in 1617. Chief Powhatan himself dies, and his son, who tries to accommodate the English at first, but eventually finds himself frustrated. Relentless expansion by the English was eating into the Powhatan territory, and it caused a powerful shaman, Netmanotnu, to speak out against the English. When Netmanotnu is killed by the English, the Powhatans had had enough. They retaliate in 1622 with a surprise attack. 347 English colonists were killed out of the 1,240 that were living in the colony. In addition, livestock was destroyed and crops were destroyed. The spring planting was prevented. Because people ran to the forts from their plantations, the forts became overcrowded and disease began to spread within those cramped fortresses. And all of that led to more deaths. But the Joint Stock Company reacted. They sent more men. Governor Francis Wyatt reorganized the settlers and took the offensive. Using tactics developed by the English in Ireland, they found a way to inflict widespread starvation among the Native Americans by destroying the Native Americans' food supplies, by carrying out winter campaigns, which drove the Native Americans from their homes when they would suffer the most. The Second Anglo-Powhatan War raged for 2 years, and then bloodshed became less frequent, but a final peace was not reached for a decade. By that time, fewer than 500 of the Powhatan people, who probably once numbered 40,000, were still alive. War leaves the company bankrupt. James I revokes the charter in 1624, and Virginia becomes a royal colony, a commonwealth. If the king's advisors tallied up the cost in human life from the planting of this first English colony in the same manner that the company tallied up the cost in pence and pounds, they would have found the outcome very sobering. By 1624, only 1,275 of the 8,500 settlers who arrived since 1607 remained alive.